It started with my lights flickering. At first, I thought it was a routine outage. Then the water pressure dropped. The heat shut off. One by one, everything went dark and silent, without warning. Minutes later, an email from the HOA arrived. It said my utilities had been shut off for non-compliance, and would remain that way until I corrected the violation. No court order. No notice from the city. Just a board decision made behind closed doors. That's when I realized this wasn't enforcement. It was coercion. And when the city found out that an HOA president had ordered utilities shut off to force compliance, the situation stopped being internal. It became criminal. Nothing about that week felt unusual at first. The house was quiet, comfortable, and routine. Utilities were steady. Bills were paid. Everything worked the way it always had. I'd lived there long enough to know what a normal day looked like, and this was one of them. The HOA had been pressing me about a compliance issue for weeks. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't dangerous. It was one of those vague, cosmetic demands that lived in the gray area, something they wanted corrected, eventually, even though it had existed for years without complaint. I'd asked for clarification. I'd asked for documentation. I'd asked how it justified enforcement. The answers were always the same. Short, confident, unwilling to explain. The HOA president had recently become more aggressive. Emails were firmer. Deadlines were tighter. The language shifted from reminders to threats. She framed every message as if the outcome had already been decided and I was simply delaying the inevitable. I checked my records. My utilities were in my name. Paid directly to the city and service providers. No shared meters. No HOA involvement. There was no scenario where the HOA had the authority to interfere with essential services. None. That's why when the first message arrived warning of escalated enforcement, I didn't take it seriously. I assumed it meant fines. Maybe a hearing. Maybe another letter filled with legal-sounding language and no substance. I never imagined enforcement would cross into something physical. I never imagined someone would try to force compliance by cutting off the basics a home depends on. At the time, I still believed the HOA understood its limits. I was wrong. And by the end of that day, the house would go silent in a way I wasn't prepared for. The outage didn't happen all at once. First, the lights flickered again, longer this time. Then the water pressure dropped to a thin, unreliable stream. When the heat shut off, the house went cold fast. The kind of cold that settles into walls and floors, the kind you feel immediately. I checked the breaker panel. Everything was normal. I checked my account with the utility provider. But current. No notices. No scheduled work. Then my phone buzzed. It was an email from the HOA president. She wrote that the board had authorized temporary suspension of services due to continued non-compliance. She said utilities would be restored once the issue was corrected. She framed it as a corrective measure, almost casual, like it was something HOAs did all the time. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was disbelief. HOAs issue fines. They send notices. They hold hearings. They do not shut off utilities. I called the city's utility department directly. After being transferred twice, a supervisor confirmed what I already suspected. There was no city-ordered shutoff. No work ticket. No safety concern. No legal authorization. But there had been a call. Someone identifying herself as an HOA representative had contacted a contractor the city occasionally used for service work, claiming there was an emergency compliance issue tied to the property. The request never went through official channels, but it was enough to trigger a partial shutdown. That's when the situation stopped being internal. The house grew colder as the hours passed. Food in the fridge was at risk. Water barely ran. I was forced to leave just to warm up and charge my phone. Every inconvenience sharpened the reality of what had happened. I forwarded the HOA email to the city. Then I received another message from the HOA president. This one was firmer. She reminded me that compliance would resolve everything quickly. She implied that delays were my choice. She suggested that the discomfort was temporary and avoidable. That message changed everything. It made one thing clear: this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was intentional. And the moment the city realized an HOA president had interfered with essential utilities to pressure a homeowner, the response shifted from customer service to enforcement. Because cutting off utilities isn't a policy dispute. It's a serious violation. And now, the people with real authority were paying attention. The city inspector arrived before the utilities were fully restored. He didn't come alone. A supervisor from the utilities department was with him, along with a representative from the city attorney's office. They walked through the house quietly, documenting everything: the shutoff points, the temperature inside, the partial restoration, the emails printed out on the kitchen counter. They didn't ask me many questions. They already had what they needed. Within an hour, power and water were fully restored under city order. Not as a courtesy, as a correction. Then the inspector made a call. The HOA president was informed, directly, that she did not have the authority to interfere with essential services. That utilities are protected under city and state law. That misrepresenting an emergency to force compliance crosses out of civil enforcement and into criminal territory. Her response didn't matter. The city opened a formal investigation that same day. By the end of the week, the HOA received a cease and desist order barring them from any involvement with utilities, access points, or service providers. Contractors were warned. Management companies were notified. Everything was documented. Then came the charges. The city filed violations for unauthorized utility interference, misrepresentation, and endangerment. Fines were issued, not to the HOA, but to the individuals who authorized the action. At the next HOA meeting, the president didn't speak. She didn't sit at the head of the table. She didn't even vote. Because once essential services are cut off illegally, authority disappears fast. And no amount of confidence can override the law when the city steps in. After the city finished its investigation, everything changed. The HOA stopped contacting me entirely. No emails. No notices. No warnings disguised as reminders. The compliance issue that had sparked the whole situation quietly disappeared from their records, as if it had never existed. Utilities stayed on. Permanently. A written confirmation arrived from the city stating that my services were protected and that no HOA had any authority to interfere with them under any circumstances. The cease and desist remained in effect, and the management company overseeing the HOA was formally instructed to retrain its board on the limits of their power. The HOA president resigned a few weeks later. There was no announcement, no explanation, just a line item on the agenda stating that a replacement would be appointed. The board moved on quickly, eager to put distance between itself and what had happened. Neighbors started talking after that. Not just about the shutoff, but about other moments when rules had been enforced without explanation, when authority had been asserted without proof. People became more careful, more questioning, more aware of where HOA power actually ends. As for me, life returned to normal. The house warmed back up. The lights stayed on. The water ran the way it always had. But the experience left a mark. Not fear but clarity. HOAs exist to manage communities, not to control people through intimidation. And when they forget that, when enforcement crosses into coercion, the consequences stop being internal. Because once utilities are touched, it's no longer an HOA issue. It's a city issue. And that's a line you don't cross and walk away from.